Their captive sat in the cabin facing the iron box he had worked tirelessly to obtain. He was a sunburned man with reckless eyes, his mahogany features marked by a network of lines and wrinkles that spoke of a life spent outdoors. His bearded chin had a distinctive prominence, indicating a man resolute in his intentions. He appeared to be around 50, with black, curly hair heavily streaked with gray. Although his face was not unpleasant in stillness, his heavy brows and assertive chin had recently given him a fearsome look when angered. Now he sat with his handcuffed hands resting on his lap, his head bowed as he observed the box that had led to his troubles with keen, twinkling eyes. It seemed to him that sorrow overshadowed anger in his rigid, composed expression. At one moment he glanced at me, a flicker of humor evident in his gaze. Holmes, lighting a cigar, expressed his regret about the situation, addressing him as Jonathan Small. In response, Small candidly acknowledged his own sorrow, insisting that he could not take responsibility for the crime. He asserted his innocence, stating that he had never harmed Mr. Sholto, attributing the act to the small and vicious Tonga, who had shot one of his dartso. He explained that he had felt as devastated as if it were his own kin who had been injured, recounting how he had punished Tonga for it. But the deed was done and could not be undone. Holmes offered him a cigar and suggested he take a drink from his flask, since he was quite wet. He questioned how someone as small and weak as Tonga could overpower Mr. Sholto while Small was climbing the rope. Small remarked that Holmes seemed to know the situation intimately. He explained that he had hoped to find the room empty, being familiar with Sholto's habits, as it was typically the time he went to dinner. Small was forthright about the affair, stating that he could only offer the simple truth. He lamented that, had it been the old Major, he would have felt no remorse for killing him, but it was unfair that he faced punishment for the younger Sholto with whom he had no conflict. Holmes informed him that he was under the charge of Mr. Athelney Jones from Scotland Yard, who would bring him to Holmes's rooms for a truthful account of events. He encouraged Small to be honest, as he hoped to assist him, suggesting that he could prove the poison acted so swiftly that Sholto was dead before Small arrived. Small confirmed this, recounting the shock he felt upon seeing Sholto's lifeless form as he climbed through the window. He expressed that he would have harmed Tonga for it had the little man not fled. It was then that Tonga had left his club and some of his darts, which Small suspected had led Holmes to their trail. Despite the circumstances, he bore no ill will towards Holmes, but he bitterly reflected on his fate. He lamented that he who had a rightful claim to nearly £500,000 was now condemned to a life of labor in Dartmoor, after having spent his earlier years building a breakwater in the Andamans, all because of the cursed Agra treasure that had brought nothing but misfortune. At that moment, Athelney Jones entered the cramped cabin, commenting on the gathering. He expressed a desire to take a drink from Holmes's flask and congratulated everyone on their success, noting the regret of not capturing the other man alive, though he recognized there had been no choice. He teased Holmes about how close the chase had been, to which Holmes replied that all was well that ended well. Admitting he had not realized the Aurora was such a swift vessel, Jones relayed what Smith had said about the launch being one of the fastest on the river, and how they would not have caught her without additional help. He affirmed that Smith had no knowledge of the Norwood affair. Small interjected vehemently that Smith was unaware of any details, explaining he had chosen the launch because of its speed, and that he had paid Smith well for his services, promising him a handsome reward if they reached their ship, the Esmeralda, bound for Brazil. Jones assured Small that if he had done no wrong, they would ensure nothing wrong came to him, emphasizing their measured approach to justice. It was amusing to see how Jones began to take on an air of importance due to the capture, a fact not lost on Holmes, as indicated by the slight smile that crossed his face. Jones informed me that we would soon arrive at Vauxhall Bridge, where he would drop me off with the treasure box. He acknowledged the irregularity of the arrangement, but insisted on sending an inspector with me, given the valuable cargo. He inquired if I would drive, to which I confirmed I would. Jones expressed disappointment at the lack of a key for an inventory, and when he asked where it was, Small curtly replied that it lay at the bottom of the river. Jones chastised Small for creating unnecessary trouble, reminding him of the difficulties they had already faced because of him. He advised me to be cautious and instructed me to bring the box back with me to the Baker Street rooms. They dropped me off at Vauxhall with the heavy iron box and a genial inspector as my companion. After a quarter-hour's drive, we arrived at Mrs. Cecil Forrester's residence. The servant, surprised by my late arrival, informed me that Mrs. Forrester was out for the evening and would likely return later. However, Miss Morstan was in the drawing-room, so I proceeded there with the box, leaving the accommodating inspector in the cab. Miss Morstan was seated by an open window, dressed in a delicate white fabric with touches of scarlet at the neck and waist. The soft light from a shaded lamp illuminated her as she reclined in a basket chair. Her sweet, solemn face bathed in a dull metallic glow from her luxurious hair. One white arm hung over the side of the chair, her entire demeanor exuding a deep melancholy. Upon hearing my footsteps, she sprang to her feet, surprise and delight coloring her pale cheeks. She remarked that she had heard a cab arrive, initially thinking it was Mrs. Forrester returning early, but she had not expected me. I informed her that I had brought something more valuable than mere news, placing the box on the table and attempting to sound jovial despite my heavy heart. I declared that I had brought her a fortune. She glanced at the iron box and asked if that was indeed the treasure. I confirmed it was the great Agra treasure, explaining that half belonged to her and half to Thaddeus Sholto, equating it to a couple of £100,000 each, enough for an annuity of £10,000. I urged her to consider how few young women in England would be wealthier than her, proclaiming it glorious. It seemed that I may have been overplaying my excitement, for I noticed her eyebrows lift slightly as she looked at me with curiosity. She remarked that if she were to have the treasure, it would be due to me. I quickly corrected her, stating that it was not me, but rather my friend Sherlock Holmes who had made it possible, as even with all my will, I could never have followed the clue that had challenged Holmes's analytical genius. I recounted how close we had come to losing it at the last moment. She invited me to sit and tell her everything about it. I briefly recounted the events since our last meeting, Holmes's new search method, the discovery of the Aurora, Athelney Jones's involvement, our evening expedition, and the thrilling chase down the Thames. She listened intently, her lips parted and her eyes glistening with excitement. When I mentioned the dart that had narrowly missed us, I noticed her complexion drain, fearing she might faint. It was merely a shock, she reassured me, as I hurried to fetch her some water, expressing that she was fine now. She felt a deep regret for having placed her friends in such terrible danger. I assured her it was all over and urged her to focus on brighter matters, like the treasure I had brought, which I thought she would be eager to see first. She expressed her interest, but her voice lacked eagerness, perhaps feeling it would seem ungracious to appear indifferent to such a hard-won prize. As she leaned over the box, she remarked on its beauty and inquired if it was Indian craftsmanship. I confirmed it was Benares metalwork, and she marveled at its weight, trying to lift it. I explained that Small had thrown the key into the Thames, and that I would need to borrow Mrs. Forrester's poker. I noticed a thick, broad hasp shaped like a sitting Buddha on the front, and used the poker to pry it open. The hasp snapped loudly as it sprang open, and with trembling fingers I lifted the lid. We both stared in shock. The box was empty. It was no surprise that it was heavy. The ironwork was 2/3 of an inch thick all around, solidly made as if designed to hold precious items, yet there was not a single piece of metal or jewelry inside. It was entirely devoid of contents. Miss Morstan calmly stated that the treasure was lost. As I absorbed her words and what they meant, a great weight lifted from my soul. I had not realized how burdened I had been by the idea of the Agra treasure until it was gone. It felt selfish and disloyal, but all I could comprehend was that the golden barrier between us had vanished. Gratefully, I exclaimed from the depths of my heart. She looked at me with a quick, questioning smile, asking why I felt that way. I responded that it was because she was once again within my reach. Taking her hand, I noted that she did not pull away. I confessed my love for her, asserting that I loved her as truly as any man could love a woman. With the treasure gone, I could finally express my feelings. That was the reason for my gratitude. In response, she whispered that she too said, "Thank God," as I drew her closer to me. Regardless of who had lost the treasure, I realized that night that I had gained something far more valuable.